everybody. So, we are back for another week of discussion in Intro to Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies. So, today we are diving deeper into social difference and intersectionality and the way those concepts relate to organizing. So, any kind of grassroots activism, coalition building type stuff, and understanding coalition building as, some form of alliance that works together for, common goals. So, our writers this week are thinking about how difference and intersectionality can, be used as helpful frameworks for creating more effective coalitions. And when we think about social difference, we're thinking, one, first and foremost, about how feminist history has not done a great job of embracing social difference as opposed to glossing over it and, essentially just, sweeping it under the rug, but really thinking about what it looks like to recognize and embrace social difference in politics and in, various forms of activist organizing that, fosters genuine collaboration. So, when we think about difference, we're thinking about the various forms of identity and experience as they relate to, race, gender, ability, and class, sexuality, how that differentiates our experiences with how we move through the world. So, each of us have a variety of identities and experiences that shape how, we've navigated the world around us, how we interact with the world around us, and how it continues to, shape how we move through the world and whatnot. So when we think about how, those individual experiences and identities are mapped onto, larger social contexts, we're thinking today about systemic power, specifically how systems of privilege and oppression operate. So we would define oppression as any way that life is made more difficult for particular social groups. And often oppression comes at the benefit or advantage of folks with privilege. So those that are empowered at others' expense would experience privilege or, unearned like assets, benefits, advantages for, the sheer fact of their, identities and, their own experiences. So, an example of how some of these systems of privilege would come together and, work in one common example to shape how we might see these like isms in action. We could take sexism, racism, and classism, for example. Those are examples of systems of privilege and oppression. And let's think about, say the example of a high-powered CEO woman that goes to her job and, may experience sexism at her job in the sense that, men may doubt, that she's really capable of carrying out the job. They, worry that she would be too emotional to make logical decisions. And all of those, like stereotypical things we might associate with sexist thinking. So that woman may be disempowered by sexism in, her job atmosphere, but she may leave her job atmosphere and, go get takeout at a restaurant. So like say, that same woman goes to get takeout at a Thai restaurant and, spouts a bunch of racist remarks to the workers that are there and, makes comments that are very classist in nature that expects that those, people working in a restaurant would wait on her, hand and foot and be incredibly frustrated if, they don't essentially like bow to her economic power. So that, that's just, one particular example of how we might see like sexism, racism, and classism working together. And in that situation, someone would experience privilege with regards to like racism and classism, but maybe disempowered by sexism in another element of their life. So, in gender studies, there is this famous saying of the personal is the political. So, when we think about the personal and our individual experiences being mapped on, to this constellation of, larger social contexts and larger social systems, we see how the personal and the social, the personal and the political, they work in tandem with one another. So, with that understanding, we can think about Audre Lorde's piece as well as Elsa Barkley Brown's piece that we're investigating a bit this week, and think about how those two authors are navigating difference and how they're conceptualizing difference in relation to coalition building. So Audre Lorde has, this beautiful quote where, she notes that certainly there are very real differences among us based on our various identities, but it's not those differences that are separating us. It is our refusal to recognize those differences and examine the distortions that result from our misnaming them. So, let's think a little bit about what it would look like to distort differences and misname them. So we could look to the Women's March that happened a few years ago as a prime example of that. So the Women's March had, a fraught go of it with organizing, in the sense that it started out basically taking the name of the Million Women March. So it started out with that particular name, and the Million Women March was actually, an organizing effort led by Black women in 1997. And some activists, such as Brittany Oliver, came forward and said, hey, like, people are co-opting this name without giving any credence to those organizers that were initially organizing under this name. And then when white organizers that had been at the helm of the Women's March, they changed the name. Various women of color activists continue to come forward and make comments about what the Women's March was centered around, in terms of like what were the activist demands being put forward, how were various folks being involved in the organizing and being centered in the organizing. And with that, various concerns that were raised, were shared on, the Facebook page and, various other digital spaces, and were deleted. And so it was like these various white organizers that were just deleting women of color's comments. And we could see this as, a prime example of distorting difference, in the sense that, with the goal of having this sort of like homogenous, unified voice for the march, the various organizers were essentially silencing women of color's concerns and not recognizing how the various differences that women of color were bringing to the table, and differences in the sense of like, how their identities and experiences could shed light on a variety of feminist issues that were being swept under the rug. They were just basically, being marginalized in this organizing effort. So we see that, distortion in practice through the Women's March organizing. And then, moving into, Elsa Barkley Brown notes that, various complexities arise from our differences, and we need to tend to those complexities. So thinking about, if folks are experiencing multiple marginalizations, they're going to offer perspective on how, the relational nature of those, various marginalizations come together, and that, is something that should be centered in activist organizing to know what sort of activist goals and whatnot should be formed around, a diversity of people. And then, one of our other writers for this week, Holly Jeanine Boux, points out that, a key roadblock to building coalitions across identities and experiences is this impulse to create a kind of homogenous unity. So when I say a homogenous unity, we're thinking about this notion of, there's no room for conflict or disagreement, or varying strategies. It's like everybody needs to be on the same page. And with that, thinking about like various categories of experience as stretching across everyone's, you're being applied as like a one size fits all model for everyone's experiences. And like, the Women's March example was a primary example of that, where, like the white organizers that were leading it were not recognizing how a diversity of demands and strategies that other folks were bringing forward, could really would really enrich the organizing itself. So when we have this narrow-minded perspective of like everyone needs to be on the same page and there's no room for divergence, then organizing really does suffer. So my mind immediately also goes to if other folks are, keeping up with various activist efforts that are going on in Richmond right now around police accountability. And I think that that's, a great example of, there's a lot of conflicts right now and disagreements around, how protests and organizing should take shape, without really recognizing that there is a lot of room for varying strategies. There's room for, conflict and disagreement, because that can be where growth takes place. So, thinking about how Richmond is a unique example of that right now, and, just thinking about, varying takes on, property damage and whatnot, and, varying takes on where folks should go from here with their organizing efforts. But once again, like I noted earlier, thinking about how key it is to keep folks at the center of organizing that have the perspective of experiencing multiple marginalizations, because that relational nature of difference will really come to the fore and help people know where to go when it comes to just understanding the complex and nuanced nature of how social difference functions. So, let's wrap it up there, and we'll talk more on the Google discussion board. And I'm interested to know more about how folks see intersectionality playing out in their own experiences and applying some of these ideas to like various institutions that you navigate as well. So I look forward to talking with you all.